Welcome to the course Digital Transformation and Technological Innovation. So, we are into our second module, that is digital infrastructure. So, let us start from where we stopped in the previous session. So, we were about to start our discussion on data center. We talked about servers, blade servers, traditional server, blade servers, then mainframe, and then the supercomputers and different aspects of those four types, right. Now, in that discussion we also touched upon that mainframe and supercomputers, they might have to be housed or rather sort of mandatory housing is to be done at a data center, right. So, let us talk about what is a data center and different aspects of a data center. So, what is a data center? So, data center is a building developed to house computer hardware with adequate climate and access controls, right. So, earlier we talked about in case of mainframe and also in case of supercomputer that sufficient ventilation and cooling has to be there, right. So, in a data center the way it is built, because main idea is to support computer hardware, especially the mainframes and the supercomputers. So, therefore, this is designed in advance, right. So, with adequate climate and access control. So, here we are also talking about, apart from climate, that is maintaining so that the heat is dissipated and the cooling, sufficient cooling is there, sufficient ventilation is there, that is there. But at the same time, who can access that particular facility, because data centers very costly, right. So, from the safety and security from both point of view, you would like to control the access to a data center facility, right. And the kind of clients that would be having their servers in via cloud subscription or other mechanisms. So, they would be large organizations or governmental organizations. Some of those organizations might be running a bit of mission critical applications, especially maybe in health space, right. Or in case of it could be in the space and defense industries also might use data centers, right. So, climate and access control, both aspects are to be controlled in a data center, right, while housing the computer hardware. And obviously, the idea is to run efficiently and consume less energy for processing and cooling. So, we put together all the important computing for lots of organization in one place, and we have specialized or adequate climate access control and all that everything put together. Then the hope is that the required energy for processing and cooling that would be optimized, that hopefully will go on the lower side in comparison to having separate server rooms or separate data centers, right. So, mostly cloud vendors or they typically run these data centers. We will talk about the firms that are providing data centers, that are having data centers and therefore providing cloud computing services. So, we will talk about that. So, run efficiently, so that is the whole idea, that there would be gains in terms of lower energy consumption. So, that has a role in overall energy consumption in that country or region, because these data centers can consume whole lot more energy, because they would be catering to so many organizations via their cloud computing services, right. So, run efficiently and consume less energy for processing and cooling, that is an important element. So, data center design has to be in such a way that this could be achieved. Now, what is happening in the state of the art data centers? So, state of the art data centers are following modular data center approach. So, what this modular data center approach is, that and one reason again for this modular data center approach here in the state of the art data center is the cloud computing vendors, right, because again they have to cater to existing and growing demands. So, it is a modular approach that also supports that growth that is happening in the demand, cloud service demand as such. So, coming back, modular data center approach is something that they follow. So, what happens in this? prefabricated container-like data center modules. So companies, these cloud vendors, they have been able to come up with data center modules which are prefabricated container-like. That means just like we talked about the blade servers and how blade can just be slided into rack chases, right, and shared cooling, shared networking, and shared storage is there, right. Similarly, the thought is that we have a modular approach where we have data center modules which are prefabricated container like, so that we can quickly as to cater to the demand, to cater to existing and growing demand, we are quickly add those data center modules to our data centers, right. So each capable of housing thousands of servers, right, just like we talked about in blade servers. Each blade server is capable of having thousands of blades. Similarly, a data center capable of thousands of holding or housing thousands of server. So this modular data center approach works well for the cloud computing industry, for cloud computing vendors in general, and therefore it works well for the country or region also, because we are talking about lowering the energy consumption overall in the region or the country as well, right. Moving on, now what these data center modules provide, right. So one is weather tight protection, because now a modular approach is taken. So and these are added to the data centers. So because of that, the way they are packed, right, this weather tight protection, that means they can just be placed on the floor and without much concern about the servers that are inside those modules. So those servers would be protected. So module servers are cooled efficiently by water and fan driven systems, right. So while the modules, the packing and the of those modules is protecting them from dust and other moisture and other things, right, weather and other things. Apart from that, the cooling also, same module is having the mechanism for cooling efficiently by water or fan driven systems. So they could be module servers or efficient in that way also, require much less energy than AC units, right. So if instead of this water and fan driven mechanism we go for the AC units, then the energy consumption would be on the higher side, because the main use case of AC units is to cool rooms and workplaces and all that, and for that purpose a lot more energy consumption is needed. While in case of data center there are no humans, it's just the machine. So therefore optimization of appropriate optimization of cooling mechanism can be done, because there is no different kind of choices in terms of cooling, that some people want slightly cooler or lesser cooler or higher cooler controls in AC. That kind of situation doesn't apply, because these are machines. So based on the kind of heat they are generating, so therefore a lower cooling requirement might be suitable. So water and fan driven, so it will overall can bring down the energy consumption. Now which are the leading firms? So leading firms are Microsoft, Google, Dell and HP. So these are the firms, especially the Dell and HP, they have been in the server technology space for a very long time. Google is running so many services, starting from search to YouTube to AI, and therefore they have their own data center servers to cater to their cloud services, massive cloud services that they provide, right. So they have their own, and Microsoft also into in cloud vendor. So these are the leading firms in terms of using data center modules and able to benefit from all these characteristics like weather tight protection, lower cooling requirement because cooling is efficient, and therefore much less energy consumption as well. Moving on, now if we look at the data center strategy, while the growth or demand for cloud computing services are going up, new startups also come up, especially the internet startups or e-commerce startups or AI startups, and all those would also need lot more support from these cloud computing vendors. and their customers also would be accessing them. So again falls back to the cloud services. So because of this growing demand, current growing demand and the future growing demand, this kind of modular data center approach is important. And then these firms like Microsoft, Google, HP, Dell, they also need slightly some more key data center strategy point. They need to work on this part, like what are the preferred regions where they would like to or they typically locate their data centers. So they are moving or they have already moved or in the process of moving their data centers or locating their data centers in regions where some of these characteristics are met. What are these characteristics? Milder climates, right. So there are milder climates, so therefore the heating issue and lifespan of data center modules, that would be covered, because milder climates are catering to some of the heat that is being released. So they are able to absorb that, right, and lower energy rates, right. So some of these places where some of these regions where you have milder climates, the population density might also be slightly on the less population, they are more likely to be less populated areas. So the energy demand from the consumers would be on the lower side. So therefore lower energy rates would be there, and data centers can benefit from that low demand in these regions. Milder climates, low demand for energy from the society consumers, and therefore low energy rates, and good point to locate these data centers in those regions. Then another one is lower land cost. So again same, milder climates and fewer people want to live in those areas because it's difficult to manage life there. So lower land cost, right. So all these characteristics, so all these remote milder climate regions which are distant from the cities and towns, there all these characteristics could be matched much easily. So therefore the cloud vendors, they are already in the process of moving or already have moved, or in future also they want to open their new data centers in such regions, right. So there win-win situation, because if the energy efficiency improves for these data centers, then obviously the energy load in that region or in that country will be more manageable. So with that data center strategy points, let us move on. Now there are other elements that are linked to data center strategy. For example, distribution of data centers, distribution of data centers to multiple locations, distribution of data centers to multiple locations in different regions, countries. Why? To absorb the impact of disasters and other eventualities that might be there. So we all the time we see in different corners of the world, we see disasters like hurricane, earthquake, terrorist attack, war happening, or sometimes we also observe that power failures happen in cities, blackouts happen for 1 or 2 days, sometimes more days, right. So if data centers happen to be located in some of these regions, then the services of these cloud vendors will impact it, and therefore all the other startups, other organizations, existing incumbent and startup organizations which are benefiting from these cloud computing services, their services, their 24/7 promise of service, that will also be impacted. So overall impact is there, right. So therefore distribution of data centers is another important point. So earlier we talked about 3 important points: milder climate, lower energy, lower land cost. But it's not as if that you are able to hold on to one particular such location and start having all your current and future planned data centers in that same place. So there can be disaster. What happens if the disaster strikes in that particular region where you are housing your data centers, locating your data centers, and future plans are also in the same region. So those disasters can disturb all that capacity, right. And so therefore distribution of data centers to multiple locations becomes a key strategy. There are other considerations that also we can think of. For example, certain countries imposing their own rules because of previous instances of law and order that happened in connection to what was posted in internet or social media or YouTube, right? And there was law and order situation, so they had to videos uploaded, misinformation floating around, and therefore many of these countries, they have started regulating these cloud service vendors or pushing these cloud computing vendors to have data centers in their country, so that in case of a law and order situation, the investigation can happen, because the data, if it is residing in other country, then the law of one country cannot apply to that data center country. Therefore, they might be regulatory firms and government agencies might force these cloud computing vendors to, if they want to cater to their market, they should be having data centers in their country, right. So, distribution of data centers is also being forced in that way. But having said that, the points remain same, that for overall efficiency, even in those countries, these cloud computing vendors, they would prefer to locate their data center in those corners, those cities, town of the countries where milder climate, lower energy rates, lower land costs are there, right. So, we talked about different situations: hurricane, earthquake, terrorist attack, war, power failures, and because of that, distribution of data centers to multiple location is an important strategy. Now, how this helps in terms of managing services to be 24/7 on. So, what we can do is, if we have data centers at multiple location, redirection of the affected centers workload. So, the particular data center which was affected, right, so particular data center which was affected, so the workload that was there, that can be redirected to the unaffected ones, right, so that we are able to quickly restore services, right. So, the incumbent or other startup firms or other firms which might be using cloud computing services from a particular data center in a particular location, and if some disaster happens, then redirection of that workload can be done in some other can be done to some other data center, and services can be restored, right. Then in case of, we also talked about different eventualities, for example, power failures. Let us say the power supply company, right, there is some failure in their network, in their grid, electric grid, right, and because of that, data center is not getting the power and needs to be shut down. So, another to meet that eventuality or to cater to that risk associated with that eventuality, cloud vendors, they might look to implement backup generator or other uninterrupted power supply, which is independent of the power supply firms or the power supply grid, right. So, different ways distribution of data centers can cater to different disaster, different eventualities in these various ways. Moving on, now if we look at the data center types, right. So, what are the different data center types that we have? So, there are lots of data center firms also that have come up. So, earlier the big tech firms, because they had lots of servers, so they became the cloud computing vendor, and then for that purpose they had to come up with data centers, lots of them, right. And then, but there were other firms also which understood the growing demand in this particular area, and so those firms have also come up. So, we will talk about some of those examples. So, there are two categories for data center types. One is cloud hyperscalers, right, for example, Amazon, Microsoft. So, because Amazon, Microsoft are the main cloud vendors for traditional businesses. So, traditional businesses for hosting their websites, for hosting their email service, or maybe a bit of cloud storage, right. For all those purposes also, simple generic services also, they might be subscribing to the cloud services from Amazon, Microsoft. So therefore, there is a whole segment across the world, so many countries across the world, so those subscription are coming to companies like Amazon, Microsoft, which are having their most of their data centers in US and some few selected countries. Obviously, they have expanded, they have now distributed few data centers to other, more dispersed to other locations across the world, but most of the data centers are still in US, right. So these firms, they are referred to as cloud hyperscalers, because they need to keep on increasing the capacity of their data centers and also plan for new data centers as well, right. Then the second category is co-location provider, right. So while Amazon, Microsoft, they are providing the main cloud service option, which are software as a service, platform as a service, or infra as a service, these three, but mainly they are into software as a service or platform as a service, right. So but then there are co-location providers, which are more closer to infrastructure as a service, right. So these co-location provider, what they do, they lease space and power to others. So they manage the data centers, and then they allow the traditional firm or other firms which want to take advantage of servers for their own computing and information systems need, but they do not want to get into managing this space and power. So they can benefit from these co-location providers. They can take their services in terms of data center is already there, space is already there, and the power and other networking is already being managed by the co-location provider. So they just need to manage their server, right. And so some of these firms are Equinix and Digital Realty. So these firms are known names as co-location providers. So two types, one is cloud hyperscalers, which are basically catering to the existing demand for regular cloud subscribers, business or otherwise, and then the co-location provider, the companies which want more control into the server and the data that they would be housing in the data center. So therefore, they might benefit from the services of co-location provider, right. Moving on. So what are these firms? So let's look at some of these firms that are there. So we can see in this table we have company and the type, whether it is hyperscaler or co-location. Then we also have global data centers, and then we have primary focus of those data centers, right. So this data is hopefully it is matching the the real data. So this has been populated using generative AI. So you can see that the companies that we have is Microsoft, Azure services, cloud services, Google Cloud is there, AWS from Amazon is there, and Meta, Facebook is also in this space. Then Oracle is there, right. And in this particular table we have mainly listed all the hyperscalers. The second slide is here we have mainly listed co-location provider. So going back to the first table, so these firms, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, AWS from Amazon, Meta, Facebook, and Oracle. So these are all examples of hyperscalers, and all of us also are subscriber of, for example, Google Drive we use, right. So many Google apps that we use. Essentially our data is also residing in Google's data centers. So how many data centers are there? 130 plus estimated number for Google, managing about 130 plus data centers across the globe, right. Most of these data centers are in US, but then dispersed or distributed across the globe also in a way. So most of our data, when we use Gmail or Google Drive or other Google services, it might be actually residing on Google's these 130 plus data centers, right. So Google is the company which is actually catering to the mass consumers, right. So more likely our data is here. Now Microsoft is also providing free access to their OneDrive, certain free GBs there. So some individual free users are also there, but mostly the users which are professional or executives. So, therefore, they also have additional subscription via their employer, via their organization, right. So, Microsoft mainly catering to enterprise users, individual or enterprise users which are connected to enterprise some organization because of their work. So, benefit is for the enterprise users or enterprise professional executives that there is a lot more ecosystem integration that you get, because the Microsoft is into enterprise software category also. So, therefore, most companies, most organizations, they would be having more likely to have Microsoft products already. So, therefore, taking it is a natural choice for enterprises to take Microsoft's cloud services, because of that kind of usage there. So, you can also see that here AI infrastructure and cloud services, because ecosystem integration that we earlier also we talked about, ecosystem integration is feasible in case of Microsoft, and it provides support for both AI infra and cloud services for enterprise software, and also including single users. While Google we already talked about, it is AI search. So, AI for the masses. So, we go to the Google search engine. Now, Google search engine has a AI tab also there, and we can go into the AI mode. So, search and AI in a way are combined. So, we do whether we type a conversational kind of a statement into Google search, or we use an interactive voice interaction thing and conversate with the AI. So, both kind of typed or voiced conversational search is happening through Google, and YouTube hosting is there. So, essentially Google services are more towards mass consumers, right. Then next category is AWS from Amazon. So, Amazon is the original cloud vendor, right. So, we look at the numbers in terms of data centers, they are on the lower side in comparison to Microsoft or Google, but Amazon is the original cloud vendor, right. So, Amazon, when they started their e-commerce service, so in that process they accumulated lots of servers, and then to better utilize those servers, and internet was already diffused, there were increased number of internet users. To be able to better utilize those servers, unutilized capacity of the servers that they were having because of the e-commerce services. So, they came up with this cloud computing business vertical, and therefore, they are the original cloud company. So, they are into hyperscaler. So, lots of some startups, small to medium size organizations, they actually take Amazon's services, right, and for their to run their own businesses. So, the organizations which are into the business space, they are especially the startups and others, they are more into Amazon. For example, Netflix, their app is also hosted with Amazon AWS services. So, Amazon is having 125 plus data centers, and their main thing is cloud computing, as you can see. So, there is no AI and cloud mixed thing, or for mass segment they are not catering like AI search and YouTubing, they are just pure cloud computing, then they are the original cloud vendor, so to say. Then Meta, Facebook, so they are also hyperscaler, and they have about 63 global data centers, estimated number, right. So, what they are using it for internal AI, right, because they Facebook is running these social media apps, whether Facebook, Instagram or Threads, right, WhatsApp. So, to be able to keep users engaged, they are using AI internally to run their platform, so that the kind of feed that is being recommended to users, that sees improvement, right, and their platforms acquire all the characteristics to sustain in future also, because there have been issues with respect to data privacy and other things connected to Facebook. So, internal AI is an important element for them to sustain their business of social media platforms, and to be able to run social media platforms which are hosting all kinds of modalities in terms of videos, text, right, links, all kinds of data is circulating in these social platforms. So they need lots of storage and servers for that. So therefore they are to be able to manage their own services, they are having these data centers. Now it is the social media category, social platform category, and the company particularly Meta, Facebook, which faces much of the regulatory or governmental pushback in terms of having data centers in their countries, right? Because people post in social media misinformation and other things that causes issues, and therefore that country might want to apply their laws. Difficulties that the data center hosted in US, and therefore to overcome that difficulty they are pushed to have data centers in different countries. So this is another company which is having lots of data centers for internal AI and social platforms. Then the last one in this category that we have in this table, Oracle. So this is also hyperscaler 64. Now what they are providing? Enterprise database and cloud. So if you are looking for enterprise database via cloud, so the Oracle is catering to that particular business, right? So these are about the firms that we have as hyperscaler. Next is the firms which are into co-location. So these are Equinix, then Digital Realty, then Entity Global. So if you look at the numbers, number of facilities, data center facility, Equinix 310 plus, and Digital Realty 300 plus. So we compare Equinix and Digital Realty with the Microsoft and Google, so you can see that numbers are way higher, but then they are into managing space and power and networking, right? So therefore that explains this. So what is the kind of primary focus that they have? Equinix is having interconnections, retail co-location. So some of the retail firms they they would like to use these co-location facility so that their data is protected well, and the interconnections taking different vendors and connection going through the internet connection. The ISPs might also benefit from their facility, because a lot more traffic has to go to facilitate internet being network of networks, and there are so many telecommunication providers and other internet infrastructure provider. So they would need interconnections, so that will also be facilitated through these co-location facilities. Similarly, Digital Realty co-location 300 plus, wholesale co-location and connectivity. And if we look at Entity Global, is global IT managed services. So there are lots of businesses which are just hosting websites, some little bit of storage here and there, email service. So you can see that kind of global IT managed services Entity Global is catering to, right? Apart from other hyperscaler, they will also cater, but Entity Global is also catering in terms of providing the as a co-location rather than giving direct cloud services. So we will stop at this point, and next session we'll talk about we'll come back to our next question, that is on how to pick right computer software. So let's stop. We'll continue our discussion in the next session. Thank you.